Well, hey, welcome to Sharing Hope. I'm your host today, Michael DiMuccio, on behalf of Medi-Share. And with us today is thriver, speaker, author, and church planter, Niki Hardy. Niki is a Brit right here in the good old US of A, and she's a cancer survivor. She's a pastor's wife, and she's a tea drinker and teller of bad jokes as a speaker and author of Breathe Again, How to Live Well When Life Falls Apart. She's all about meeting you when life's not fair and helping you discover that with God, life doesn't have to be pain-free to be full. And then she encourages you to go live that life. And so, Niki, it's our pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining us and sharing hope.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Michael.
Well, good to have you. And here we are, feeling like we're on the tail end of the whole social distancing thing. It's been several months now. States are beginning to open, but let's kind of start things by just asking, how have you and your family adjusted? Go back to March when all this went down, and how have you adjusted since then?
Well, it was like falling off a bit of a cliff for us. As church leaders, we lead a church. It's a decent size, but we weren't already streaming live and all those things. So it was a mad rush to figure out how we were going to be there for our congregation. And our main concern was, how are we going to stay connected in this time of disconnection? We wanted to maintain a sense of community as well as worshiping together. So figuring all that out, and we don't have like a whole tech department. So it was a bit of a DIY scenario, but we're there now, finally. So that's really great. And then, as a family, we've got 2 kids in college. One was graduating, and that kind of fizzled, but he's a swimmer and an engineer and didn't get to go to nationals as he had worked so hard for. We've got one who's a musical theatre student, so she is singing and dancing and acting in our den. And we've got a high schooler whose lacrosse season fell apart. So there's a lot of kind of unmet dreams and hopes and anticipated things that kind of fell away. And I think we're all dealing with that in slightly different ways. But it will be good to get back to hugging people again.
Yes. In the meantime, in the church, I think we call those growth opportunities. Right?
Yes. Growth opportunities.
Yeah. Well, speaking of being stretched in different ways, why don't you tell us how you made your journey and got your call to come from Britain to the United States? Talk about that a little bit.
Yes, it does seem a little backwards. I must admit, when we didn't come to faith until our first year of marriage, and we were both working corporate jobs, had 2 company cars, life was sweet, but we kind of felt, well, is there more to life? And that led us on a journey of exploration and eventually coming to faith. And we immediately felt God say to leave our jobs. And so my husband went into the nonprofit world and worked with drug addicts on the streets of London, and I went into teaching. And then, quite a number of years later, he went into the ministry, and our church in London was growing and thriving and was beginning to church plant all over the place. We have a sister church here in Jacksonville, Florida, and that was one of them. And we were connected as a church to people here in Charlotte. And so this was an obvious place to church plant. Church planting is relational. We don't just kind of pray and stick a pin in a map. And so we eventually came out here to church plant in Charlotte with our 3 young kids. They were just 8, 6, and 3 at the time. And we ended up here in Charlotte, and it's been a roller coaster. Church planting is not for the faint-hearted, but we've seen God do some amazing things.
Sure. Now remind me, what year did you come out and plant?
2006. So it'll be 14 years this summer.
Wow, 14 years. So when you got here and put your pin, if you will, in North Carolina, you blended right in with your accent, didn't you?
Of course. It's funny because I would say I don't have an accent. You have an accent. But yeah, it's funny. I think now after 14 years, although I haven't picked up much of an American accent, I'm really terrible at an American accent. But I don't think I sound that different to everyone until I hear another English person. And then I'm like, oh my goodness, you stand out so much. Is that what I'm like? So yeah, it's quite funny. I always say that I'm from the deep south of England.
Nice. We typically on our interviews, Niki, we often ask our guests to speak to a time where they've gone through a time of uncertainty. And I know if I would ask you that, just from knowing your story, I'm sure you would point back to the period of time when you lost your mom and your sister to cancer, and then you yourself were diagnosed. Talk about this in a little bit in this whole realm of us offering hope to people.
Yeah, so before we moved out here, we went to seminary in Oxford, and it was at the beginning of those 2 years that my mum passed away from cancer. Hers was aggressive lung cancer, and we were in Oxford, and my sisters were both in England as well, and she was living in Vancouver, Canada, where she had remarried a number of years before. And so there was this difficult geographical distance of managing that and trying to love and care for our mom, even though she was miles away. And then unfortunately, she passed away. And then once we'd moved here, a number of years in, about 6 years after losing my mum, my sister, Jo, in England, was diagnosed with the same thing, with aggressive small cell lung cancer. And she died at just the age of 43 on New Year's Eve. Just as everybody else was watching the ball drop and celebrating, we were holding her hand in hospital and watching her pass away. And then, believe it or not, like you said, just 6 weeks later, it was my turn. And mine wasn't lung cancer like theirs. Mine, and I've only just got used to, saying this on TV or on interviews, mine was rectal. I mean, it was a kick in the butt, literally and figuratively. Wow. And as you can imagine, I was still trying to grieve my sister and my mom and process that. And, what did it mean for my family? And of course, it raised a whole ton of faith questions as well. Kind of, are you kidding me, God? After, all we've done for you, and after Mom and Jo. And so, yeah, it was a really difficult season. It felt like there was no time to process and to question God in the midst of it all.
Wow, that is intense. And, it's funny the things that God brings us through. And sometimes we really don't have any really answer until we get through it. We look back and we see, what God has done. I know one of the things in your life from that season, you obviously became a cheerleader, so to speak, for anybody that's been diagnosed with cancer or really gone through, a traumatic time in their life, or when life is like falling apart for any reason. It feels like they're merely surviving a life that has fallen apart and really they never planned or imagined. So tell us, what exactly do you do in your ministry, and how do you encourage people?
Yeah. So what came out of that journey, I'm a Brit. I've got a stiff and perfectly waxed up a lip, and I can keep calm and carry on with the best of them. And I was like, I am determined to survive. And if so many people either have been touched by cancer or know someone who's had cancer, they know that, with chemo and radiation and surgery, it gets to a point where surviving is all you're doing. And I felt like I was stuck in this survival mode. And eventually I met people who called themselves not cancer survivors, but cancer thrivers. And I was like, ooh, I want that. I want what they've got. It was like they had something that was more hope-filled, more alive. And it was as if they were saying, I know life stinks right now, but I'm jolly well going to squeeze the most out of it. And I realized that what I had done, both emotionally, but also in my faith, was put off the abundant life that God has for me until life got better. And I had said, well, I'm now in the storms that he said that we would have, the troubles. And
Sure.
so the abundant life must be waiting off in the future. And I realized these were people were saying, no, they don't have to be separated like quarreling siblings, to opposite ends of the room. They can coexist, that life doesn't have to be pain-free to be full. And so I kind of set about figuring out how to do that and what that looked like practically. And that's where my book came out of, Breathe Again. It's for anyone whose life has fallen apart, either in an instant or, for so many of us, it unravels slowly over time. And so I wanted to be a cheerleader, part BFF, best friend, part spiritual coach, and be super practical about, well, how do we do that? How do we become thrivers and not just survivors?
Wow. No, that's good. And it's so needed. There's so many people, like you say, different things, whether it's some type of sickness or some type of great loss. Imagine being a business owner in these days. If you didn't, what about some of the riots that are now going on and people are losing their businesses and, economies will struggle to get back. And, so anybody with loss, what do you say, or what, you talked about you use the word practical. What practical things would you offer to people who feel stuck because of some type of great loss? What can they be doing to kind of get into that abundant life or get into that place of thriving?
It's a great question. So in the book, I, have these 7 tools that people can use to do that. But before that, what I realized I had to do was address the rubbish I believe, the lies that I believe about God and about myself. And and replace those with the truth about whose I am and who I am, so that I'm going from a strong and firm foundation. But then the practical things that I talk about in Breathe Again are, choosing brave. And we think being brave is some big thing, and we're either brave or we're not brave. But I came to realize that choosing brave is small, intentional choices that lead us to that full life. And that could be a difficult conversation with someone. It could be getting up to play with your kids when your depression hits hard. It can be anything that leads us towards that full abundant life that, by the way, isn't all glossy and happy and skippy like, Instagram and Facebook would tell us. God's abundant life is, as it says, the word means to overflowing. And it's a life of connection and intimacy and joy and laughter and hope and trust and all those things, as opposed to being healthy and wealthy. So choose brave and then trust God. And it sounds so trite, but I knew I had to trust God. I just didn't know how, because I was like, I know I've got to trust you, God, but right now I'm mad at you. And so what does that look like? How do we build his credentials, in our mind? Because I'm like, well, I'm not even going to invite a plumber into my life, to mend my sink without checking his credentials. So I'm going to check out God's credentials, so I take people through a process of what it means to trust God when we're hurt and our trust in him is shaken. And then I talk about, being vulnerable with God and with others, about finding community. I found community really hard. I hate to say it, but I didn't want anything to do with the cancer community. I was afraid of getting close to people who might, they were more likely to die than the rest of the population. It sounds terrible, but I didn't think I could handle that level of grief. And I was arrogant. I was like, I've got my oncologist, I've got Google, I've got my family. Thanks all the same. So it's an encouragement to not just find the people who can offer us sympathy, but can offer us empathy. We need the kind of inside crowd and then an out crowd as well. And however much we struggle with community, we worship a God who is by his nature community. And so we have a community-shaped hole within us. So encouraging people to find that community, and then embracing the journey and realizing that we have to grieve to grow and that life isn't waiting off in the future. And then I talk about practicing gratitude and how hard that can be, not just for the rubies in our life, but for the rubble as well, And then I talk about reaching out and how, although it might not be the time to start a worldwide ministry or take in your, neighbor's ailing mother-in-law, any small act of kindness towards somebody else actually builds us up way more than we think. I came with the view that, I'm running on fumes. My life has shattered. I can't be the glue in somebody else's life right now. But actually, when I offered a text of encouragement to a friend, or was able to offer somebody else a meal or pray with someone, actually, I was blessed and fed way more than they were. So those are some of the practical things that I go through in the book.
Oh, that's good. That I find that to be true as well. It's like we're looking for all the water to flow into our reservoir. Yeah. But you don't get anything back until you let out that water in someone else's life. And then it seems like the Lord keeps that cycle going. But I really I like what you said about the abundant life and what it means to overflow. And it reminded me in Philippians when Paul said, he gives us a peace that surpasses all human understanding. Mm-hmm. You're going to be, the word tells you, you're going to be in circumstances that aren't comfortable, that aren't nice, that aren't feel good, heart tingly moments, So you need these things from the Lord to get through those tough times, right?
You do.
So as we're kind of like, getting into some of the practical things too, you mentioned about the lies that we believe about God. Can you touch on some of those things, or the ones that seem to be the most that people get hung up on?
Yeah, well, it was so interesting as I was, researching for the book. I came across the work of a psychologist called Martin Seligman, who has researched thousands of people when it comes to resilience and what stops us coming out of trauma. So people who've gone through trauma, and some people come out the other side and are resilient, and others remain trapped within the trauma. And he found these 3 lies that we believe about ourselves and our circumstances. And I think we can apply them to God as well. He didn't obviously do that, but I extrapolated out, if you like. But the 3 beliefs are personalization, it's all my fault, and pervasiveness, my whole life is affected, and permanence, life is never going to be different. And I knew those were things I believed about myself. I thought cancer was all my fault, even when I was told it wasn't because of my genes or because of my mom or my sister. I believed that every part of my life was affected. I couldn't see a part of my life that didn't seem to bear the scars of my cancer gut diagnosis, whether, it was the kids, every argument. And I was like, oh my goodness, they're obviously now not able to cope and are doing drugs, and it's terrible. And permanence, I just couldn't see a way out and through when we weren't going to be living with the consequences of it. So these are things we believe about ourselves, but actually we worship a God who enters into every single one of those. And that is such a joy to realize. And so those are kind of the things we often believe about ourselves and God. But I realized that I was believing things like, well, God's obviously abandoned me. He's not listening. He's mad at me. If he's trying to teach me something, if I could jolly well figure out what it was, then we could get through this. And so I had to really work on figuring out what those lies are. And I had to dig a bit. You have to kind of go on a little treasure hunt and think, well, okay, so I believe this. Well, and what do you really believe underneath that? And then replace those with truth about who he is, about what he's done. Even if what we're going through is our fault, well, we have a God who came in to take the price of that and to meet us with grace and not condemnation. And, God will meet us in all our different places. And so, and the Bible is just packed with truths about, how loved we are, how he's never going to leave us, and how he treasures us, how we're his children. And it's those beliefs that are going to be able to kind of spur us into trusting him, having hope and finding joy and all those things. Wow.
Good insights, and obviously from a very personal place that comes from. So, I hope no one out there listening to this, has family or friends diagnosed with cancer. But for those hypothetically that would, some of these things already you're speaking of are already tools, but what tools would you lend or speak out to folks in helping them to encourage loved ones who are going through this journey and this battle with cancer or some other illness?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because for many of us, we're not quite sure what to do or say when somebody else's life falls apart. And, I had people say the most inappropriate, hurtful things, not because they were trying to be mean, but because in fear, they just didn't know what to say. I had somebody say, "Oh, my uncle just died from that." And you're like, "Oh, thank you." That's really encouraging.
Wow.
But so it's great to think about, well, what we can do and what we can say. And I think the most helpful thing we can do is agree that it's awful. Just agree that their pain is valid and that we are there for them. So whether that's when we see them face to face or in a text, it's just acknowledging how hard it is and saying, I am with you and I love you, without trying to fix it. It's not our responsibility to do that. But I always think, a quick text, I'm thinking of you. How can I pray for you today? Or how are you today? By saying today, we're kind of acknowledging that this journey is going to be a roller coaster from hour to hour, day to day. And so asking for specific things you can pray for, and then praying for them, and then also setting yourself a bit of a reminder to check back in a few days. How's that going? In the book, again, I give all sorts of practical ways that we can love people. Yes, we can do a meal, but I love the one where you offer to send your kids round if they are old enough to walk the dog, mow the grass. And it's kind of a triple win, because your kids get a lesson in loving someone, and, your friend gets blessed. And so there's all sorts of different things like that you can do, or just sending a card. A snail mail card is such an encouragement, keeping a stack of those. There's so many ways that we can love and support one another.
Wow, what a wealth of information and resource you're giving here. I wonder, what projects you have coming up, whether it's writing a blog, whether it's another book, or what are you setting your sights on these days?
Yeah, well, I'm working towards a big online conference, a summit called the Trusting God Through Cancer Summit, which will take place in the fall. But at the moment, I'm writing and speaking on my website, nikihardy.com. And if people want to grab a couple of chapters of the book to, try it and see before they think about buying it, they can download those there. So it's just nikihardy.com. And I've got all sorts of resources there, whether it's free chapters of the book, I've got devotions and playlists and all sorts of things. And even at the back of the book, there are resources for people as well. So yes, I just want to be able to love on people the way people loved on me.
Very good. Very good. Niki, thank you so much for being a part. And I want to thank the viewers who've tuned in and have grasped information from this. I pray that it refreshes you and gives you confidence as you walk through your own battles and or offering help to those that you may know that Niki spoke of, that you can use those tools and tips. And of course, as she just said, you got many, many resources to pull from going to her site. So Niki, again, we want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing hope.
You're welcome. It's been wonderful to be here.